in many ways intellectual and also potentially in terms of U.S. politics. Joel Kovel has made important contributions to the world, and we welcome, almost made some, and is contributing to future changes in the world with his ongoing work. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Joel Kovel.
Thank you, Derek. And the really inconvenient truth is that, yes, we must make very fundamental changes, but no, technology in itself is not at all the answer. We need a social transformation. We need a transformation in production and consumption. We definitely need a transformation in consumption, but that implies a transformation in production. And transformations in production means we have to look at the ruling system of production, which is capitalism, and we have to finally say, enough of this. This is a system that is destroying us. If you had a disease of this sort, you would not compromise with it if you were a rational person. If you're a rational civilization, you would not compromise with this disease. You would not stop at anything short of bringing it down and making this change. And anything I say tonight it pales beyond that insight. Because I don't have a blueprint for the change. I have some fundamental ideas about the kinds of parameters that are necessary for the change. It's up to humanity to fulfill those changes and to do it in respect to the full complexity, because we have a world where you have a dominant system of production, capitalism, and then you have all kinds of alternatives and reactions to it. You have a vast panoply of peoples north and south. Is how some of these things appear in the global south. Here we are in the global north, but we have one single global economy. We have to learn how all of the parts of that global economy work and how all of those parts can be brought together in a mighty battle against this ruling system of production that is dragging the planet and ourselves and our civilization and indeed our species to destruction. I call capital the efficient cause of the crisis, the prime driving force, the elimination of which is the essential condition for an ecologically sane future. This is because the capitalist economy produces things in order to produce capital, which is the value term that expands. The chief product of capitalism is capital. In order to produce capital, it produces commodities because the capital is embedded in a nascent form in the commodities, and the commodities have to be produced on an ever-expanding terrain because of the competition between capitalist firms, so that if any of them does not expand, it will be eaten by somebody else, because it's a privately owned means of production that drives the capitalist system onwards. We hear sometimes talking about limiting capitalism, having community capitalism, having citizens' movements that control the rate of growth of capitalism. I want to disabuse you of this notion. You do not limit capitalism, or rather, if you do limit capitalism, which is a good idea, you will at the same time destroy capitalism, because growth, the growth term, the expansion of money, is the lifeblood of capitalism. You might say, well, I guess I'll limit how much I breathe, I'll breathe, 5 minutes on and 5 minutes off. You can't do that. You will die if you do that. Capitalism is the same way. It cannot be limited. It can only be as it is, or it will destroy itself. And that's indeed what we have to do, but we have to think of what lies beyond it. Now, when I talk about eco-socialism, what I mean is this. It's the name we give to a form of society that would adequately meet the criterion of bringing capitalist production down and replacing it. The prefix eco signifies that it is the pattern of relationships between humanity and nature that needs to be healed, as expressed in a set of values that we may call ecocentric. And the stem, socialism, refers to a lengthy tradition of building alternatives to capitalism, all of which significantly have more or less come to a bad end at this point, and in some cases, notably China and its former Soviet Union and its satellites, have been prodigiously destructive to nature as well. Why should eco-socialism be any different? Let's look briefly at why socialism failed in its first epoch. Politically, the societies in which these socialist revolutions took place were unprepared for democratic self-management. Strategically, they were weak, war-torn, and under attacks of all kinds from the dominant capitalist powers. Economically, they were both backward and peripheral in relation to their dominant economic interests. First epoch socialism was therefore like the proverbial fruit that fell close to the tree. Its goal became to liberate labor from capital, but it saw the implementation of this goal as more of a redistribution of capital's benefits rather than a qualitative transformation of the mode of production itself. It remained essentially trapped in the idea of ever-expanding production, as you can see if you look at the speeches made by the Soviet leaders and by Mao Zedong and so on. The idea it would not question the industrial model through which this expansion unfolded. The ideas of limiting growth or working in harmony with nature were scarcely ever conceived, much less put into practice. In contrast, eco-socialism is grounded in the transformation of capitalist production. This is essential to the resolution of the ecological crisis, as it is capitalist production and not the distribution of its product among classes that breaks down nature. Let's look briefly at the crisis as it surfaces in its most momentous form, the questions of energy, global warming, and the carbon economy. I'll be very compressed here. We can expand on this in the question period if you like. First, the best climate science tells us that we have very little time before runaway positive feedback effects take hold, for example, through the melting of ice caps and glaciers. These will likely make the planet Earth unlivable unless there is a drastic diminution of the order of 90% of the transfer of carbon from below ground to the atmosphere. We have to put it in the starkest possible terms. The fundamental issue is to stop transferring carbon from the ground to the air. It sounds simple, but the whole industrial capitalist civilization runs on it. Second, the dominant ideologies and structures, including academia and established science, and that's all too true, respond to this profound challenge with business as usual. They use various economic instruments to allow capital to accumulate and hope to check atmospheric carbon essentially by means of technological fixes, a la Thomas Friedman. He goes right up to the threshold and says, we need technology. And that's what Gore says. The Kyoto Protocols, which regulate planetary regime to limit carbon, are entirely constructed along such lines. In other words, they turn over the regulation of the climate crisis to the capitalist class itself. And the next generation of protocols will undoubtedly do the same unless mass action from below stops it from doing so. Okay? Third, since capital is money in motion and lives through the generalization and expansion of commodity production, and since the transfer of carbon from ground to air is a function of commodity production through the industrial system, it follows that however indirect and mediated the path, it is the accumulation of capital itself that spews death-dealing carbon into the atmosphere. It also follows that to the extent that the instruments of capital, like Kyoto, work, they do so by allowing capital to grow. I mean, that's the reason that Kyoto is accepted, because it has the plum that people are going to make a lot of money by limiting carbon. But what they will do, of course, if they make money in a capitalist system, is then be faced with the dilemma that every capitalist has when he makes money, which is, what am I going to do with it? Well, I have to invest it. What am I going to invest it in? That which produces the greatest value, and so on and so forth. So the more money that is made through accumulation by Kyoto is only going to be turned into more airliners, more, SUVs, and whatever the system has to expand. It's very important to bear that in mind. There's a fundamentally self-defeating mechanism in place when you have a capitalist criterion. Therefore, the instruments of capitalist society eventually but inevitably worsen global warming through expansion of the economic product and chaotic expansion, it must be added, as capital can do no other. It is no longer, in short, capitalism is not simply unsustainable, it is a culture of death and indeed suicidal. An eco-socialist alternative seeks to replace capitalist accumulation through a social transformation whose ground is ecological integrity. Thus it achieves sustainability through the affirmation of life. Eco-socialism is a kind of visionary path whose steps are intermediate struggles drawn from the spontaneously appearing challenges thrown forth by the ecological crisis at different points of the globe. Now, the word intermediate that I mentioned is crucial and essential. Eco-socialism, like life itself, cannot spring all at once into being. It is, I would say, prefigurative. That's a very important word. It takes embryonic shape in numberless ways that contain within themselves the lineaments of an ecologically integral world. Prefiguration expresses the germ of the future, and as it moves towards that future, it evolves with other elements of an eco-socialist configuration. In the case of climate change, eco-socialism would consist of the incorporation of all prefigurative practices whose common ground is the inhibition of the transfer of carbon from earth to sky, and that also work against the regime of accumulation. This would extend from struggles in the global south to block the life-destroying extraction of petroleum from indigenous lands, as is taking place in a great number of places in northwestern South America, in Bolivia and Ecuador and the like. In the global north, struggles against global warming would certainly include struggles against militarism and imperialism, against the oil wars, against the military, which is the biggest single consumer and waster of fuel, and certainly sees to it that the fuel keeps running. That's the point, okay? Alongside all those that break the power of the energy, oil, and automotive giants so that ecologically sane modes of transportation, energy production, etc. can arise. Such a strategy involves democratizing the state, introducing new forms of cooperative enterprise, developing superior technologies, but in the context of new social relations, and putting them into autonomous practices and so on. Now, I'd like to just conclude with some basic principles here of an eco-socialist transformation, sort of drawing from some of these lessons. Eco-socialism is a socialism whose ground extends beyond the empowerment of labor to the restoration of the integrity of nature. For this, a new ecological mode of production is necessary, which is to be created from the elements of prefigurative activity. Now, as labor is the conscious and socially organized transformation of nature, the two aspects of eco-socialism, which exist roughly today as the red and the green tendencies, are actually deeply continuous and should not be treated as separate departments. The most radical demand of eco-socialism is precisely that restoration of nature's integrity requires the empowerment of human beings through the freeing of their labor. That is to say, the freeing it from capitalist exploitation. That is, although eco-socialism firmly supports appropriate technologies and direct intervention at sites of ecological degradation, its primary focus is on the way human beings are shaped to live within nature and to transform nature through labor. Eco-socialism holds that the alienation of labor makes for the alienation of nature, and is in fact the rupture point in human history through which the degradation of nature and eventually the ecological crisis occurs. Therefore, an ecologically rational society needs to be free, where freedom is defined not in terms of bourgeois individualism and license, but as an ever-developing inclusiveness of the self. We require, in the memorable words of the Communist Manifesto that still stand as the touchstone of both socialism, first epoch, and eco-socialism, quote, an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. That is a quote from Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the Communist Manifesto. In sum, a basic definition of eco-socialism is that it be a mode of production in which freely associated labor chooses ecocentric values to heal the earth and to make it flourish once again. The overcoming of accumulation is not therefore a general impoverishment of humankind. It is rather an overcoming of poverty that entails the redefinition of wealth. This involves multiple and interrelated shifts. One, from production for exchange to production for use. Two, from social relations ruled by quantity to those embodying qualities. We would call use values become the end of production and not the means to the end of expanding exchange value, money and capital. Three, from a society ruled by general estrangement and fetishism to one of mutual recognition. From another angle, this entails a shift from egotism to solidarity. Four, from the notion that the world consists of many disconnected, split-apart things to that it is an organically differentiated plenum. Nature should no longer be seen as something split apart from the human, but as the human body writ large. This entails a notion beyond use value and radically beyond exchange value, that the nature and the whole of the universe has an intrinsic value, a value which we receive from it without having to make anything out of it, indeed a value beyond production itself and in relation to which production takes shape. For production is the specifically human embeddedness in nature, yet before we produce, we live from nature. Next, from a society in the grip of addictive commodity consumption to one of self-determined production, we often fail to recognize how consumerism is a reaction to powerlessness, isolation, and spiritual despair. It is then both a consequence of capitalist alienation and a condition of ecological destruction, measured by ever-expanding waste dumps and wasted lives. In short, the more we are, the less we need to have. The more we have, the less we are. Since alienation, involves separation, eco-socialism, like socialism itself, is predicated on overcoming the separation of producers from the means of production. This is a nodal point at which the eco term joins the socialist term. A differentiated kind of connectivity defines the healthy ecosystem, one that flourishes and evolves. More broadly, the shift towards eco-socialism implies a shift from the generalization of commodity production, which is what capitalism is, to the producing itself of ecosystems. In other words, the goal is to make ecosystems and not commodities. That is to say, farms, workplaces, etc. can be seen as human ecosystems, where the human being is part of nature but also its transforming agent. These flourish insofar as they follow the path of ecological integrity and degenerate insofar as they follow the path of accumulation. The commodity is the cell of capitalist society, and capital becomes an earth-ravaging cancer through the endless expansion of commodity production, which is the only way capital itself can be reproduced. The ecological crisis, from global warming to global pollution, is the sign of this cancer once it reaches a certain size and surpasses nature's planetary buffering devices. An ecosystem is a set of interrelated elements within nature, and nature is the integral of all ecosystems. A commodity cannot be an ecosystem, since the exchange value within it depends upon separateness or alienation. That indeed is the foundation of money and the entry point into the process which eventuates in capital and the ecological crisis. Life is the self-replication of ecosystem, or the set of such replications, as the peculiar organs of an organism have each their own ecosystemic nature. That is to say, our circulation, our endocrine systems are also ecosystems within a larger ecosystem. And each ecosystem is in association with all other beings. It is evident then that in producing ecosystems, whether these be gardens, freely evolving political associations, workshops, music, etc., we also reproduce our life. This perspective gives an insight into how a new eco-socialist mode of production can both sustain life and preserve the self without the interposition of commodity and money. Although, let me qualify, this does not mean that there is an absence of money in eco-socialism. It does mean that money now serves simply as a medium of exchange and not as a repository of value or a speculative commodity in itself. Of all commodities, the deadliest is the conversion of human creativity into labor power for sale in the labor markets for a wage. It is this that sustains capital and degrades humanity. Marx envisioned socialism or communism as an overcoming of wage labor. He saw this as part of the system of vision, of overcoming the separation of producer from the means of production. This remains a core eco-socialist goal to be worked out by creative people. There's one last momentous point distinguishing eco-socialism from first epoch socialism and capitalism, though it can be no more than mentioned here. We have observed that capital is a diseased fruit of a long process of development, in the course of which humanity became estranged from nature. Now, what was the point of origin of this process? The fall, if the term be used, of humanity from grace, and the beginnings of our estrangement from nature. I would argue, and venture to say, that this ensued from the estrangements of gender. In the course of male violence towards the female, an ancient crime whose consequences continue to unfold in male dominance and the submission of Mother Earth. Thank you.